my name is Andrea Williams. I'm the Chief Executive of Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. It's my great pleasure to be with you today at the 2022 Truth Exchange Symposium. Rebecca and Peter Jones are great heroes of mine, and I am particularly thankful for their teaching. They have asked me today to speak on the issue of law and personhood. The context into which I've been asked to speak is stolen identity, the theft of the binary in contemporary society. What are your pronouns? How do you identify? Peter Jones has said that these current cultural questions are a restatement of one of the oldest questions of the human race. Who am I? Today's answers carry, he says, a beguiling temptation to define ourselves by looking within, whereas the other version implies that we should look outside ourselves, asking our Creator to tell us what we need to know. Peter Jones says this, that whether we are in the church or the White House, or indeed in Westminster in the heart of London, at home or in our nation's schools, many in our culture, including Christians, yes, it's very true, including Christians, are facing an identity crisis. If we fall prey to the deceptive influences that tear us away from our ties to our Maker, Creator and Saviour, we are left impoverished, empty and in despair. We fall into what Peter Jones has so clearly defined, a oneist confusion, where all things are one and the same and one, and there are no real distinctions. Who could ever have imagined, how could I have ever imagined, that when I qualified in 1988, that I would be representing a doctor in the United Kingdom who would lose his job simply for saying that on a medical form he would be unable to put that a biological man was a woman if the biological man said he was a woman. Who would have ever thought that I would be in a position whereby teachers in schools would be disciplined and removed from their jobs for raising issues around children identifying in the opposite gender and refusing to affirm them? All of this is our day-to-day reality at the Christian Legal Centre. We have 9 full-time lawyers here. There are 35 staff here at our base from where I'm filming in the United Kingdom at Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. We are inundated with cases just like these that I have outlined. So stolen identity, the cultural challenge. I'm going to frame this lecture by looking quickly at the cultural challenge, what the Bible says, what the science says, and into that what the law says. And how can we respond? People often say it's the law that sets the culture, which for sure, law has a massive impact on culture and can help the cultural good. But what is clear on this issue of law and personhood is this, that very often the law gets broken, the practice becomes a reality, and law follows a practice, law follows a culture. This is why it's so important to contend, as I have been doing, ahead of the culture, or as we see it breaking in the culture. What I've seen in relation to this is, for many years, being told that to contend in this way or to view that what might happen or to see the dangers is to be extreme or to be phobic. What has been extraordinary is the church has not seen it, Christian lawyers have not seen it, indeed have often been part of it. I say this not to point fingers or blame, but really as a matter of lament, deep lament. And to say where can we at the Truth Exchange, and where can we as men and women of God who understand and see, where do we go from here? And what are the lessons that can be learnt from here in the United Kingdom? With a cultural challenge, well, as Peter Jones might say, and pointing us to Genesis 1, we are made in the image of God, male and female, creator and created, the distinction. We look to who we are because we look to him. It used to be so simple. That was simple. The law was defined around such truth, male and female. That was simple. But today, as we know, there are multiple genders: female, male, bigender, cisgender, butch, asexual, epicome, demigirl, third gender, genderqueer, non-binary, bigender, demigender. There's confusion. How does the law follow such confusion? That's the cultural challenge. These are the things. Someone says, I am a gender. What does that mean? They define it themselves. They make up these words. There is no context, no anchor of truth and reality. Then this is actually pretty old news now. But at the moment at the moment in its cultural history was an affirming within the society of the cultural shift. Bruce Jenner had been in our living rooms, or maybe not yours, but in many living rooms, on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, much loved by many as the father in that house. But all this time, he says, living his own personal lie because he was suppressing who he really was. And who he really was Caitlyn. But look, this is who he really is and what he really is denying. The Bruce Jenner, the Olympian, this extraordinary physique, God-given, that could actually do such amazing sporting achievements. Today he looks sad. Today he's still a cultural figure. But there's a sad reality about his life and the life of his family that plays out into the cultural landscape. The one that's really new and pressing right now, but is also catastrophically sad, is the story of Ellen Page. Ellen Page, who was in Juno, a pro-life film, or really a film that talked about how to make a different choice than abortion when in an unplanned pregnancy. This was Ellen Page when she filmed that particular film, Juno. This today is Ellen Page, going by the name of Elliot Page, on the front page of Esquire, what every man should know about a post-Roe world. That's interesting, that's cultural. But here, the euphoria of Elliot Page. So, defeminized, breasts removed, testosterone still actually very slight, trying to look more manly. This is the culture. Celebrity, transgender. The denial of who God made her to be. Increasingly with plastic surgery and hormones looking like God didn't make them to be. So this is also another truth. As I've said, this idea of multiple gender realities, 58 was recently a number given by Facebook. What does the Bible say all about this? Well, we've already spoken of that, haven't we? The Bible says in Genesis 1, so God created man in his own image. Man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And also the fact that we're created male and female. And Jesus said, affirming this in Matthew 19, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh from which the miracle of life and procreation can occur. What a magnificent truth picture. What a magnificent way to live. Anchor in which to live. What a magnificent way in which to do culture. What a magnificent way in which to do family. What a magnificent and simple way to express law and legal protections and definitions. How do we go so wrong? How are we in law going to define who exactly this person is? Male or female? What about the names? What about the relationships that she identifies in? What about the family that she might choose to have? How do all of those things get understood in the culture and in law? When you depart from twoism, creator and created distinction, and depart from the way in which we are commanded to live, when you throw away the safety nets, you end up in a world of multiple 58 genders going on 558 today, no doubt. Differences are to be respected. We hear this in Deuteronomy. A woman should not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. In 1 Corinthians, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. That's a very high estate. So these earthly vessels are holy vessels. Our bodies are a temple unto the Lord. And sometimes, and I know there will be much greater theologians in the room than I to answer this point, but what about eunuchs? There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. Eunuchs are all males, no ambiguity. Eunuchs are infertile for one reason or another, and the context is about marriage. Those who have made themselves eunuch is most likely those who choose to remain single. It does not support trans ideology, as we often hear in theological circles around this. And in Galatians, equality does not remove difference. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Difference exists. We are equal in the sight of God. To be accorded equality, it doesn't erase difference. What the science says, again, there will be greater scientists than I in this room. But essentially, what does the science say? Well, there's certainly up until recently, those that identify as trans are the tiniest proportion of society. 0.6% of US adults identify as a gender that does not correspond to their biological sex. And until really recently, this would have been understood as gender identity disorder, as a medical condition that was real, that hurt, that needed to be treated to help somebody's mind and incongruence in their head to be adjusted to their physical reality. And I have to say this, that being in the public space on these issues now for well over 30 years, that 1 decade ago, when in Britain the legal and cultural discussion was all around same-sex marriage, that was 2011, 2012. Although I was very aware of this, I did not see it coming almost immediately that same-sex marriage was permitted. Trans ideology came fully into the consciousness of the public and became the next cultural line. This may look obvious, but prior to a decade ago, This push and this normalisation was not something that was real in law or in media or in politics, certainly here in the United Kingdom. And it took even me by surprise. The hypothesis that gender identity is an innate, fixed property of human beings that is independent of biological sex, that a person might be a man trapped in a woman's body, is not supported by scientific evidence. Studies comparing brain structures of transgender identifying and non-transgender identifying individuals have demonstrated weak correlations between brain structures and cross-gender identification. They do not provide any evidence at all for a neurological basis for identifying in the opposite sex. Compared to the general population, adults who have undergone sex reassignment surgery continue to have a higher risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes. And one study found that compared to controls, sex reassigned individuals were about 5 times more likely to attempt suicide and about 19 times more likely to die by suicide. So this is really very serious indeed. And the other truth is this, that what we're now experiencing is more confusion in our children, younger and younger. Again, there's no evidence that all children who express gender atypical thoughts or behaviour should be encouraged to socially transition. Again, what the study shows that children, when permitted to go through puberty, tend, in the end, to be able to align their thoughts, their mind, with their biological reality. We know for campaigning purposes and for legal purposes, what happens is this, with regard to intersex, it is lumped together with transgenderism. So what's happening here is that the transgender lobby and the gay lobby, in effect, uses what is a very serious medical condition, an intersex condition, aligns it with the campaign objective and says, you are discriminating against these people as well. Well, intersex conditions are biological conditions that cause disorders of sexual development. They're incredibly rare, sometimes affect the hormones, but today, in 99% of cases, when children are born and genitalia, it's not clear from the genitalia whether the child is male or female. Now tests can be done through DNA tests in order to understand whether that child is biologically male or female. These tests are now more advanced. 30 years ago, they may not have been able to identify the sex of the child. Today, they can. Clinical advice from the Intersex Society of North America is not to raise children with intersex conditions as a third gender or without a gender. Gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, a very real condition for a few people. It's a psychological condition. It's real and it's painful. But prevalence of this is as low as 0.005% to 0.014% for adult males and 0.002% to 0.003% for adult females. This is much lower than the prevalence of transgender identification, which is increasing rapidly in the populations in the West. Now it's between 1 in 215 to 1 in 300 people. And certainly in our schools today, we're seeing a massive rise in children identifying in the opposite gender. So let's look at the history of the law in relation to all of this. Well, it goes right back to, in many ways, when we began to remove clear definitions around marriage and divorce in our laws back in the 1960s, when we began to liberalise law generally around sexual behaviour. So with the advent of contraception, with the advent of the swinging 60s, that's the cultural backdrop with the possibility of being able to have sex supposedly free sex without procreation. Of course, that's a whole different issue, because the truth is, when we look at the amount of unplanned pregnancies and the amount of abortions that are massive despite contraception, that also didn't really work. But the truth is that what happened as a result of all of that was that the laws in the 1960s began to reflect the culture. So homosexuality is decriminalised in 1967. We also have abortion decriminalised in 1967. We have the first weakening of the law around divorce by the Divorce Reform Act in 1969. That was followed on by the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973, where essentially it becomes much easier in the United Kingdom to divorce without having to prove adultery by one of the spouses. We have a rise in cohabitation and laws that begin to reflect the rise in cohabitation. As a result of creating laws which no longer protected absolutely the life of a child within the womb, and with fertility treatments, reproductive technologies growing and being developed, what you then get is the possibility of having children out with the sexual union of one man and one woman, because the possibility now is to create a child in a test tube, the first IVF baby. Then we have a position of being able to create children, embryos in laboratories and reimplanting them. What does all of this do? Well, it actually changes the makeup of the way in which people have children. I'm saying all of this in relation to this issue because it's all one. It actually meshes into the cultural change of who we are and how we live. Because against this, what you then have is marriage laws reflecting cohabitation laws, which then means that the remit of family opens up. How do you identify family? Once upon a time, it was one man and one woman married with children. What happens across this last half century in the United Kingdom, the last part of the 20th century, is you get the dismantling of that, because divorce becomes easy. Accessing family becomes different, because you can now have family, you can gain family not just by way of adoption and fostering and naturally, but you can then have family as well by way of surrogacy, IVF and so on, donor sperm and so on. So then, with all of this, a push comes from the homosexual lobby to have their relationships recognised as well. So you have the Civil Partnerships Act of 2004 and the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, because at the very same time, what you have is people saying in England that various sexual rights need to be recognised. Well, men and women begin to say, I identify in the opposite sex. This is something that I need to have recognised in law. So for the first time in British law, we have a situation whereby a person born in one sex is recognised in law as another sex, and you are penalised by criminal law if you reveal that that person who identifies in a different sex today, you are penalised in law if you reveal birth sex. We then also have the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act of 2014. And so what then happens essentially is this: you have ideology and reproductive technology redefining sex and family. So in the midst of all of this, you get the loosening around gender, you get the family redefined, you get access to family being redefined. So trans men can have babies because they're biologically female, but they're trans men. So they still have a womb. They want to be named as the father They want to raise their child. They may well be in a same-sex marriage with the person that they will call the mother of the child. These are all new legal realities with which courts have to grapple. The nascence of gender recognition law in the United Kingdom. This really begins in the case of P versus S and Cornwall County Council in 1994. It's a British case that went to the European Court of Justice under Article 177 of the EC Treaty. This was raised by a domestic tribunal in the United Kingdom for a preliminary ruling on the meaning of sex within the European Directive, that for gender reassignment to attach to an individual in employment law, some overt step towards the physiological reassignment of gender had to be required or can be required in law. The European Court of Human Rights has also later upheld the position that member states are free to act within a margin of appreciation when requiring medical assessment prior to granting someone the civil status of being gender reassigned. So to explain that, in 1994, the test was taken into the European courts to say, essentially, does someone have changed physically in order to be assigned in law the attribute of the opposite sex? And the answer came back essentially yes, and that has been maintained because this later case of Garçon and Nicole is much later, about 5 years ago. That is borne out in the Gender Recognition Act of 2004. So 1994, you get the Cornwall case taken to Europe. In 2004, the Gender Recognition Act in the United Kingdom allowed an individual, for legal purposes, to change how their sex is registered in official documentation. And it had the legal effect of recognising that individual as being of a different sex than their birth sex. The applicant seeking legal recognition of their gender reassignment, now this is how it was passed in 2004, must be 18 years of age, must have lived out in the opposite gender for a period of at least 2 years, ending with the date the application is made. There needs to be evidence of gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, provided by a medical practitioner practicing in the field of gender dysphoria or as a chartered psychologist. A gender recognition panel must also determine if the evidence provided is sufficient to grant the certificate. So we can see that in some ways as recently, less than 20 years ago, and this is still the law, the hard law in the United Kingdom is this. Again, like all of these hard laws, for someone to be recognised in the opposite sex, they have to have lived out in it for 2 years. There have to be medical practitioners that say that there's a real gender dysphoric issue. There needs to be a psychologist involved, and then government documents can actually say that the biological male is a female. So, although for the first time this is a denial of reality in law, the bar is very high, a little bit like when we passed the Abortion Act in 1967. For the first time, we did not protect the unborn child in the womb, but the bar was very high. It was meant to be very rare. It was a criminal act unless very high specifications were met. Now we have abortion on demand. Here, the specifications are very high indeed. The Equality Act prohibits direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, harassment and victimisation because of one's perceived or actual gender, reassignment. In Section 7.1 of the Equality Act 2020, so this is 6 years later, gender reassignment is defined as a person has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment if the person is proposing to undergo, is undergoing, has undergone a process or part of a process for the purpose of reassigning the person's sex by changing physiological or other attributes of sex. So we can see already that in 6 years under equality and discrimination legislation, the line shifts. So the hard law of gender recognition of 2004, that this is a serious medical condition, that high criteria has to be met, is shifted very quickly under equality and diversity legislation, which then protects this idea that someone has a different gender, or as Peter Jones so eloquently put it, that their true gender is what they see within them rather than the physical reality that God has given them. And that this has to be protected under equality legislation in the law. In relation to Section 7, recently there has been some pushback surrounding its protections. A conservative reading of Section 7 has been prescribed by the Employment Tribunal, saying that the legal protections afforded to gender reassignment under the Equality Act only apply to a portion of the people who identify as transgender. While the explanatory memorandum to Section 7 notes that gender reassignment does not require medical supervision of the process involved, what is clear that a complete and cogent commitment to live out life as a person of the opposite sex is required. This must be undertaken by someone with the legal capacity to do so. So this is how Hansard, the Parliament, was passing this through when the Equality Act went through. The Hansard record, that's the parliamentary record, is also clear at this point that and this was by a government spokesman, Baroness Thornton, that gender reassignment is intended to apply to people who make a commitment over a period of time to live permanently in their non-birth gender. So that's where we were in 2022. Gender identity is not synonymous with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. That's where it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be synonymous. But in fact, what has happened culturally is that gender identity has become synonymous with gender reassignment. So anyone, even a child aged 2, which is in our newspapers this week, we have Stonewall, the campaign lobby group here in the United Kingdom for same homosexual rights and also trans rights, is saying that children as young as 2 are saying that they're born in the wrong body. Cross-dressing or drag is also not characterised as gender reassignment. That was in the parliamentary record in 2010, but in July of 2022 in the United Kingdom, we have up and down the country in our libraries and in our schools, Drag Queen Library Hour. This comes after a month of pride in our schools and in our libraries. It's viewed as something that is protected, it's viewed as something that is fun, it's used as something to break down barriers in our children and to resist it. Anyone that seeks to resist it, we're seeing that they're pushed back, they're actually closed out of the libraries. Furthermore, quite extraordinarily, what we're seeing is that drag is normalised in our schools and promoted and upheld by government agencies, whereas Christian groups are out. And you will be aware that we've had 2 cases in the last month where Samaritan's Purse, Franklin Graham's organisation, has been deemed homophobic in our schools, and their support of Samaritan's Purse has been removed. Worst of all in these cases, may I say, is the fact, because these were actually Christian schools or were Christian in name, is that real Christians in the school have not stood with the Christians that want to stand. So I think this is one of the things that we really are seeing of late. It's no longer Stonewall testing the culture, 1960s, 1970s, 1990s. It's no longer liberal Christians testing the culture, 1990s, the noughties, the 20 teens, 21 teens. What we've got in the last couple of years is the absolute outworking of Christian brother versus brother. Real Christian leaders, evangelical leaders, not holding firm on these issues. Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights includes a right against compelled speech. This is with regard to pronoun use. Article 8 of the Convention, right to private life, and Section 19 of the Equality Act 2010 prohibit indirect discrimination, allow for policies and practice where compelled pronoun use is not required if it's done in the pursuit of a legitimate aim, but this is usually turned on its head. So how do we see this whole thing outworking? Well, back in a decade ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Church of England, said it's clearly essential, this was in Parliament, that stable and faithful same-sex relationships should, where those involved want it, be recognised and supported with as much dignity and the same legal effect as marriage. So we have the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the church, but I've just said that this is now also leading evangelical leaders are not standing on this. It's not just the Church of England. But we have, and they've been the Church of England has been in discussion for the past decade on this issue now. But what we have also is this, that in 2017, the bishops affirm gender transition. Bishops are encouraging unconditional affirmation of trans people. The statement talks of recognition of a transgender person's new identity. It describes gender transition as a moment of personal renewal. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, has described it as something very beautiful, and that there is a new affirmation of baptismal faith liturgy that can be used to mark transgender transition. So you actually are not born again in the spiritual sense. You take on the gender that you think you are. And this is affirmed in the church. And there is liturgy that follows it. So church liturgy is following the culture. David Cameron, again, 10 years ago, talked about legalising same-sex marriage, not despite being a conservative, but because he was a conservative. And the Conservative Party is entirely socially liberal on the trans issue. And Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, now of course involved with Facebook, multi-genders, he says very quickly, when all of this law is passed, it's all going to become very normal. And in our Department of Education, you have, I'm an LGBT champion, pronouns she and her. So that's from the Department of Education. If you look at Church House, a lot of the coming out of the formal Church of England, we also have pronouns on their headed notepaper. And then what you have is that this is all normalised in our schools. So the books this is all recommended reading, normalising same-sex households, normalising trans, gender-bred person, gender identity, genderqueer, gender expression. But all of this, sexual orientation, this is a norm in our schools. The gender unicorn, gender identity, again using this intersex, physically attracted to. This is for our babies. Schools are accepting children into class in the gender that they identify. And one of the leading cultural setting schools, Brighton College, has said that it has 40 children who do not identify with their sex at birth, and another 36 are gender fluid. Well, this simply wasn't the case 10 years ago. So what we're seeing is this massive cultural shift whereby we're listening to what people are saying is the inner voice within them versus their reality. But those that challenge it, those that even make a mistake, this is a young lady that we were helping aged 10 who was saying that she refused to participate in Pride, was excluded from her primary school. Her mother was visited by social services and the police.
I only learnt what homophobic means the other day, and it means that you don't like LGBT people. So I was confused when she said that I was being very homophobic. I'm not homophobic, I'm just against the point of putting it in schools and teaching it to children. I think that they're trying to confuse children into saying, what are you? Because before anybody knew what LGBT meant, everybody knew what gender they were. But now people are confused and they're saying that they're bisexual and trans because they're confused, and people are trying to say it's okay. But before all of this happened, they were completely confident of who they were, but now they're not. My mum isn't telling me to say this, it's completely myself, because my mum's not the one that's going to school to see this happening, I am. So this is my opinion and what I'm saying to stop LGBT lessons from happening in school, because it's really affecting other kids, and even though you might not think that it's affecting other kids, it is, because now they are losing confidence in themselves and looking at themselves and thinking, why am I this person, why can't I be someone else?
I thought the teacher said this is actually doing good for the kids. It's bringing them knowledge and to be more happy with themselves. Are you saying that this is doing the opposite?
Yes, I'm saying that teachers and other people that are teaching this to young kids are completely wrong, because they're saying that it's doing children and people good, but it's not. Because before all this happened, people knew who they were and they knew who they're proud of, and they knew their self. But since this came out and into school, children are now facing the choice of what gender they are by the age of 4. Some people by the age of 4 are saying that I don't want to be a girl anymore, or I don't want to be a boy anymore. But that's because schools or nurseries are trying to say to children that it's okay to become something else that you're not.
This was Joshua Sutcliffe who said, "Well done, girls," to a group of girls. This is in 2017. And when he did that, he was he was suspended as a teacher, dismissed ultimately for gross misconduct. And now, that was in 2017, so we're 5 or so years later, they're after him for his teaching licence, saying he's not fit to work with children. Nigel and Sally Rowe, children as young as 6 were coming into their school, little boys dressed as little girls. For raising this with the head teacher, they were called by the education authority transphobic, bigoted, if they couldn't accept the reality of the 6-year-old child. We're currently dealing with a case where a teacher was to have a child come into her class after the summer holidays last year, a little boy identifying as a girl. She said that she felt that that was not good for the child, for the class. And as a result of that, because she refused then to conform with the name change, or was raising it as a safeguarding issue around the child, has also lost her job. That case is ongoing. A vicar who was a governor on a school, for raising the training that was going on, John Parker, for raising the kind of training that was going on in the school, he was forced in the end to resign from both his ministerial post and from the governing body. Kira Bell, judge, ruled that under 16s cannot consent to puberty blocking judge. This has been a matter of appeal, but Kira Bell was given puberty blockers at her request, age 16. She's now detransitioned, and she's made the case that no child can consent to puberty blocking drugs. So she's now an extraordinarily brave young woman. The High Court ruled that children do not have mental capacity to understand what's involved with puberty inhibition, and therefore used a declaration requiring application to the family court before medical intervention begins. Kira Bell's case was lost on appeal on the grounds that the High Court did not have the authority to issue such a declaration, and so this case is now going to the Court of Appeal. This is David Macarith, who, as a medical doctor, said he would be unable to say that a biological woman was a man or vice versa on a medical form. For that, he was removed from his government position. We see social services intervening in families where parents refuse to accept that their children may be transgender, so we have threats from social services to remove children, or from the police to remove children. We're managing so far in these cases to keep parents and children together. And again, after a while, what we're seeing is that this case was many years ago, this particular case that you see on the screen here. And now that child who at the time was identifying as a boy is now living happily as a girl. We see that those who seek to simply to bring evidence around this are shut down. They're locked out of major institutions, universities, in order when they want to do studies around this issue. How can we respond? So how can we respond to all of this? By being courageous, by being in this place, by being at this symposium today, by absorbing the extraordinary teaching of Peter Jones. Peter, that will long outlive you, that will long outlive me. For what you have spoken so clearly in this time, the theology that you have brought is clear, that we are creatures made in the image of our Creator, male and female. This is a great truth. Thank you for such teaching. How can we respond in a culture that's hurting, in a culture that's broken, in a culture that doesn't understand its identity, that doesn't know the Creator? We must speak to them of the Creator. We must respond with massive compassion by being ready to give answers, being courageous, by really believing that the speaking of the gospel is powerful itself, by understanding these issues. And let me say, there are more and more stories of people who have detransitioned. We're going to see these stories, we need to speak these stories, and we need to speak of the hope that is in Jesus Christ. And I want to bring you some of these stories. Hundreds of young people are experiencing trans regret, but the most wonderful thing that I have to say is this, that most recently, here at Christian Concern, we have the most fantastic young woman called Libby Littlewood, who lived out as a man. And I just want to introduce you to her now.
I showed early signs of gender dysphoria from when I was sort of 3 years old. I had the dissociation, I had sort of dreams of genital mutilation and these kinds of things. I genuinely thought I was going to grow up to be a boy at certain points, and I didn't understand why I wasn't growing into a man when I hit puberty. You know, that was very similar to around the time that I discovered transgenderism and really married myself with that, was around that age of 12. I discovered transgenderism as a term. I discovered kids transitioning. You know, the internet is a powerful tool, so I discovered all these YouTube videos of people taking testosterone or having these transition surgeries and showing off their scars and all this kind of thing.
And then she was married to a wonderful young man, Ramin, that she met at our Wilberforce Academy. That is the hope when we see these stories, men and women radically transformed by the love of Jesus Christ, radically transformed because they know who they are in him. That is the hope that we have. Thank you for giving me time here and giving me this wonderful and most amazing opportunity.